"He's just a guest," my daughter said, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. The room froze, forks clinking softly against plates, laughter dying on lips that seconds ago rang with joy. The words didn't just bruise, they shattered. They didn't float casually into the air. They dropped like a hammer, crushing the silence that followed. I sat at the very edge of the table, the seat I had chosen out of habit, out of respect, out of long-forgotten humility. And now, with one sentence, she had drawn a border around me, exiling me from the very home I once built, the walls I painted with my own hands, the beams I reinforced when storms had shaken the roof. Her pride was visible in the tilt of her chin, the steel in her tone. She wanted everyone to hear it, to understand that in her house, her name carried weight. Her decisions were final, and I was nothing more than a tolerated intruder, like some stranger brought in from the cold. A guest, that was the word she chose. Not father, not protector, not provider, not the man whose back had bent under years of labor to make sure this very meal could be placed on the table. No, in her world tonight I was stripped of all titles, all dignity, reduced to a chair filler, someone temporary, someone unnecessary. I felt the eyes of others at the table shift toward me. Some lowered their gaze quickly, ashamed perhaps, but not enough to speak. Others wore faint smirks, as if the demotion of a father to guest was somehow amusing, or worse, deserved. Betrayal is never a thunderclap. It is a whisper that grows louder each time it goes unchallenged. And tonight her whisper had become a verdict. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest ached. Memories pressed against me, uninvited and cruel. Her small hand in mine when she was a child. Her voice, once soft, once calling me daddy with joy, not scorn. I had been the one who lifted her on my shoulders, who stayed awake at night when fever burned her forehead, who worked extra shifts so she could go to the school she once bragged about. And now, at this table decorated with lights and laughter, she carved me out of her life with 5 words. "He's just a guest." The knife in my chest twisted because it wasn't only insult, it was a rewriting of history, an erasure of all that had been poured into her life. My daughter wasn't merely dismissing me in front of strangers. She was tearing away the truth of who I was and replacing it with a lie convenient for her pride. I looked down at my hands resting on the table, hands cracked with age but once strong, hands that had signed papers, carried bricks, patched roofs, written checks that kept this house from falling apart. These hands held the proof of my belonging, though no one cared to see it. And yet, in that moment, I said nothing, not out of weakness, but because silence often speaks louder than any argument. She mistook my quiet for defeat. The others mistook it for surrender. Inside me, however, something else stirred. Not rage, not yet. Something heavier. The weight of injustice, the kind that doesn't scream but waits. And as I sat there, dismissed at my own family table, I knew that truth always has its hour, and paper, cold, silent paper, often speaks louder than prideful tongues. But she did not know that yet. Friends, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to this story from. Has anything similar ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. It truly helps us grow this channel and bring you more stories every day. Now, let's continue. The laughter at the table resumed in fragments, but not for me. I sat in silence, feeling like a shadow pressed into the corner of a painting, present yet unwanted. My eyes wandered across the room, and every glance was a wound. The walls still carried faint scars from where I had hammered nails to hang her childhood drawings. The wooden floor beneath their polished shoes once bore the weight of my tired steps after long shifts, each creak a reminder that I had built this space with sweat and care. The roof above, strong and unyielding, I had patched during storms when rain threatened to drown us. My fingerprints were hidden in every corner of this house, yet to them, I was invisible, worse than invisible, I was foreign. How cruel it felt to be treated as a stranger in the very home where I once held her close when thunder terrified her. I could almost see the ghost of her small figure running down the hall, calling my name, trusting that I would always answer. Now the same halls echoed with footsteps of arrogance, her pride louder than the laughter of her youth. She stood tall, claiming ownership with her gestures, as though none of this had ever been shaped by my hands. I studied the faces around me. None dared to acknowledge the truth. They smiled at her words, nodded at her confidence, enjoying the warmth of a meal placed on a table that would not even exist without the years I had labored to keep the roof over our heads. Their silence was a heavier betrayal than her insult. A daughter can wound, but an entire room turning away, that is abandonment of the soul. My heart burned with quiet ache. I was not angry in the way she expected. Rage was too small a word for what lived inside me. What I felt was exile, a banishment, dressed in polite smiles and fine dishes. They offered me food, but not belonging. They poured me wine, but not respect. I was the ghost who paid for their comfort. The architect denied entry to the building he raised. The fire in the hearth crackled, and I stared at it as if it might answer me. Flames devoured the logs, wood cut by my own hand years ago from the forest edge. Every ember mocked me with its brightness, reminding me that even fire acknowledged my labor, while my own daughter denied it. Yet, beneath the ache was something heavier than sorrow, deeper than betrayal. It was the knowledge that truth cannot be buried forever. The foundations of this house did not rest on her pride, nor on their silence. The foundations were built on my work, my name, and my sacrifices. Pride may erase words, but it cannot erase deeds. Silence may cover truth, but it cannot destroy it. So I sat there, quietly enduring their laughter, their glances, their dismissal. They believed they had written me out of this story, but I knew better. Paper lasts longer than pride. Ink speaks louder than arrogance. And one day, this house would remind them who truly belonged within its walls. Her voice cut through the room like a whip, confident, sharp, and rehearsed. She spoke with the authority of a ruler addressing her court, not a daughter sharing a meal with her father. Every word she uttered was soaked in pride, each sentence declaring that this was her house, her domain, her triumph. The table listened and obeyed, as though her voice carried law, nodding with smiles that felt rehearsed. I sat in silence, listening to her rewrite history, erasing my name as though it had never been etched into the story of these walls. She boasted about decisions made, about improvements and choices, about the strength of her ownership. Her tone carried no gratitude, no trace of memory. She spoke of the roof as if she had raised it herself, of the land as if her hands had broken the earth, of the lease as though her ink had sealed it. She left no room for the truth that I had been the one who signed, who labored, who fought to keep the home from slipping away in years when bills piled high and the world seemed determined to grind us down. Each sentence was not just pride, it was a theft. She was taking what was mine, what was owed to me, not as possession, but as recognition. She carved me out of the past, painted herself as the pillar, the builder, the savior, and the room accepted it. Their silence was a cloak they wrapped around her, shielding her from the weight of truth. I sat, watching the movements of her hands, commanding gestures that waved away decades of my work. It was as though I was watching a stage play where I was no longer a character, only a forgotten extra seated in the shadows. Her words climbed higher and higher, each one building a monument to herself, a monument erected on the foundation I had laid, though she never once looked in my direction. There is no pain sharper than hearing your own story told by someone else, stripped of your name, scrubbed of your sacrifices, and claimed as theirs. It was not anger that burned in me now, but something colder, the kind of silence that comes when a man realizes he has been buried alive in his own legacy. But there is one truth about pride. It builds tall towers without foundations, and towers without foundations always fall. She believed the house belonged to her because voices in the room applauded her, because no one stood to correct her. She thought history could be erased with arrogance and silence. But I knew better. The walls remembered whose hands had touched them. The beams remembered whose shoulders bore their weight. The paper tucked away in the landlord's file remembered whose name had given this home its existence. I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that sometimes silence is not defeat. It is preparation. Her voice was strong now, but paper is stronger than pride, and ink lasts longer than arrogance. The air in the room grew heavier than the fire in the hearth. My daughter's words still lingered, but it was not her voice that cut me the deepest. It was the silence that followed. Around the table, eyes darted quickly, some toward their plates, others toward the glistening glasses in front of them. Not one dared to meet my gaze for long. They knew. Every relative present knew the truth. They had seen me carry lumber when the walls first went up. They had watched me climb ladders, sweat dripping into my eyes, repairing leaks under storm clouds. They had eaten meals at this very table when times were lean, and I worked double shifts to keep the lights from going dark. They knew. But knowing and speaking are not the same. Their silence was not ignorance, it was betrayal. A betrayal sharper than my daughter's insult. An insult can wound, but silence becomes complicity. They shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, yet not enough to stand up for me, not enough to challenge her pride. They chose safety and silence over truth and courage. And as I sat there, excluded in the house I had built, I realized that betrayal is not always a shout. It is often a whisper left unspoken, a defense never given, a truth buried under fear of confrontation. I studied their faces one by one. My son-in-law, who once came to me for advice when he had nothing, now sat stiff, his lips pressed tight, pretending the insult had not been spoken. My daughter's friends, who had marveled at the generosity I once showed, looked away, sipping wine to fill the gap of conscience. Even the younger ones at the table, eyes wide, uncertain, sensed something was wrong, but followed the example of the older. Silence as loyalty, silence as comfort, silence as cowardice. Every tick of the clock in the hall was a drumbeat of isolation, each second stretched into an eternity of shame. Yet beneath the shame, there was something else, a fire they did not see, could not feel. They thought their silence erased me. They thought by saying nothing, they could support her rewritten story. But truth does not vanish because a room refuses to speak it. Truth is patient, and it waits until paper, ink, or history itself forces silence to break. I sat in that silence, a man unacknowledged, a father turned into a stranger, yet within me there was no collapse. Instead, there was a slow and steady rise of resolve. Let them whisper their betrayal with lowered eyes. Let them bury the truth under their cowardice. I knew something they had forgotten, that deeds cannot be undone, and names cannot be erased when they are written where it matters most. And so I remained silent too, not as they were, out of fear, but out of strength. I knew the day would come when this silence would crack wide open, and when it did, the weight of their betrayal would return to them like a mirror, forcing them to see what they had done. Her words were not enough. She needed action to seal the humiliation. With a wave of her hand, sharp and careless, she gestured toward the chair where I had always sat, the seat that had been mine for years, the place where I had presided not as a ruler, but as a father. She ordered someone else to sit there, as though she were reassigning a mere piece of furniture, as though my presence at that table had never mattered. The scrape of the chair against the floor echoed louder than any insult. It was not just wood moving, it was dignity being dragged away. I stood for a moment, unsure if the air had left my lungs, or if my body simply refused to breathe. My place was gone, claimed by another without hesitation. Laughter and chatter resumed around the table, and I was left standing, displaced, stripped of the smallest anchor of belonging. I moved slowly, finding another chair at the very corner, far from the warmth of the fire, far from the center of the meal. I sat down quietly, like an intruder who had slipped in unnoticed. The irony burned. This was my house, my table, my life's work, and yet I was treated as if I had trespassed into something sacred that was never mine. From my new seat I could see everything, and perhaps that was the cruelest gift of all. I could see her smile, proud of her authority. I could see the others adjusting to the shift as though nothing had been lost, nothing had been desecrated. I could see the chair where I once belonged now occupied by someone who avoided my eyes, ashamed perhaps, but unwilling to stand in defiance of her command. Their cowardice filled the room more heavily than the scent of roasted meat and wine. I tried to eat, but each bite tasted of ashes. Food loses its warmth when respect is absent. Wine grows bitter when dignity is stripped away. Every gesture at that table reminded me of my exile. A man does not need to be thrown out of his home to feel homeless. Sometimes it is enough to be pushed into a corner while the world pretends he was never meant to sit in the place that once belonged to him. But in the sting of that displacement, a strange clarity settled in me. They thought they had won. They thought they had reduced me to a ghost at the edge of their feast. But they had forgotten that ghosts carry memory, and memory cannot be erased by arrogance. I sat in the corner, yes, but it was they who sat in a house built by my hands, eating from a table paid for by my labor, warmed by a fire lit from wood I once chopped. The corner did not erase me. The chair did not define me. Their denial only revealed the depth of their blindness. They believed I was diminished, but in truth, their actions only prepared the ground for revelation. One day, the corner seat they forced upon me would become the place from which truth rose, undeniable and unshakable. I rose quietly, as I had done countless times before, when food needed to be carried, when dishes had to be passed, when the small burdens of a meal required another pair of hands. Habit guided me more than thought. It was my nature to serve, to ensure others were fed before me, to take pride in small acts of care. But as I reached for a dish, my daughter's voice lashed out, sharp and cutting, the sound striking me harder than the weight of the porcelain ever could. She waved her hand as though swatting away a fly. Guests shouldn't meddle. The words did not just wound, they humiliated. My fingers tightened around the dish, trembling not from age, not from weakness of the body, but from the violence of being stripped of dignity. These were the same hands that once lifted her into a chair when she was too small to climb. The same hands that steadied her spoon when she first learned to eat. The same hands that fixed every broken thing in this house so she could live in comfort. And now, those same hands were dismissed as intrusive, unworthy even to pass a plate at the table I had provided. I set the dish down carefully, though inside I felt it slip from me like a stone sinking into deep water. Around me no one spoke. A few looked down quickly, pretending not to notice the cruelty, as though ignoring it made them innocent. Others forced polite smiles, uneasy but complicit. Their silence joined her insult, making it heavier, unbearable. My humiliation was no longer a moment. It was a performance, with the entire table as audience and accomplice. I sat again in the corner, my chest tightening. Humiliation is not just the sting of words, it is the theft of memory. For in her command, she erased every moment I had ever served her, willingly, joyfully, with love. She reduced decades of care to nothing, casting me as an intruder where I once was the foundation. My silence was heavy, but it was not weakness, it was survival. For anger would have shattered me, but silence kept me whole, even if broken inside. And still, beneath the ache, a thought flickered like a spark. If she saw me as a guest, then so be it. Guests can be ignored, dismissed, waved off. But the truth, written, signed, sealed, could not be waved away with a gesture. Pride may rewrite stories for the moment, but it cannot rewrite paper, cannot erase ink, cannot silence the name that still lived where it mattered most. So I let her words hang in the air, cutting me deeply but also preparing her downfall. For every humiliation carries within it the seed of justice. And though I trembled that night, it would not be my hands that shook in the end. It would be hers. As I sat in the corner, pushed aside and silenced, my eyes drifted across the room, not to the faces that betrayed me, but to the walls themselves. They seemed to whisper memories no one else could hear. In the grain of the wood I saw my past. In the strength of the beams above I saw my sacrifice. And suddenly my mind returned to the day the lease was signed. The memory came with such clarity that I could almost smell the ink on the paper, feel the coarse fibers beneath my pen, hear the steady voice of the landlord as he clasped my hand firmly, his words a solemn acknowledgement. This house is yours. I remembered the weight that lifted from my shoulders that day, the pride that swelled in my chest knowing my family had a place to call home. I had walked through these empty rooms then, touching each wall with reverence, already imagining laughter filling them, already dreaming of Christmases, birthdays, ordinary dinners that would turn into extraordinary memories. The floors had been bare, the paint chipped, but to me it was a palace, because it was ours, because it bore my name. Every corner of this house carries my fingerprints. The nail hammered into the frame to hold her first picture, the notch carved by accident when I dragged furniture inside, swearing softly but laughing afterward, the ceiling I patched one cold winter night when rain poured through, my body soaked, but my heart relieved because I had kept them dry. Even the garden outside, the soil I turned, the seeds I planted, was an extension of me. This house was not walls and windows. It was my life poured into brick and wood. And yet, as I sat there now, my daughter's voice had erased it all with a single phrase. He's just a guest. None of them remembered. None of them cared to remember. Their eyes saw only her performance of ownership, her pretense of authority. To them, the history of this home began when she chose to claim it. My sacrifices were invisible, my name forgotten, my deeds swallowed in the silence of their complicity. But the house remembered, the walls remembered, the ink on the lease remembered, the landlord's handshake, firm and binding, remembered. Paper does not forget. Ink does not fade as quickly as gratitude. And though they dismissed me tonight, though they rewrote history in whispers and arrogance, I knew one truth that carried me through that humiliation. Memory can be buried under silence, but it can never be destroyed. As I sat quietly, I felt the weight of that memory press, not as sorrow, but as strength. They could deny me with words, but they could not tear my name from the foundation of this home. My presence was carved deeper than their pride, deeper than their betrayal. And one day, the truth, silent, patient, unyielding, would rise from those very foundations, and they would have no choice but to face it. She lifted her glass with the poise of a queen presiding over her kingdom, her smile bright and her voice steady, and in that single gesture she declared the evening hers. The room hushed, eager to hear her words, as though she carried wisdom, as though her youth and pride had been forged into authority. She spoke of her home, her triumph, her future, her plans. She spoke of power and success, as if they had sprung solely from her will, as if no one else had ever bled, sweated, or sacrificed to make this place exist. Each sentence was a proclamation, each toast a rewriting of the truth. Her voice was clear. her confidence unshakable, and with every word she pushed me further into the shadows. I could feel myself being erased, as though my name, my history, my very presence was chalk-scrawled on a blackboard, and her words were the cloth wiping it clean. She left no space for acknowledgement, no pause for gratitude. To her, I was not even a memory worth mentioning. I was absence dressed in silence. I sat there, my glass untouched, my heart aching with a quiet fire. I watched her command the room, watched relatives lean closer, nodding as though her words carried weight, though I knew they carried only vanity. The walls around us seemed to tremble with irony. They had once echoed with my hammer striking nails, with my voice calling her to dinner when she was small, and now they echoed with her pride, her arrogance, her cruel determination to make everyone believe this home had been born out of her strength alone. Cruelty often wears a beautiful mask. Her pride sparkled in the light of the chandelier. Her laughter rang like music, but beneath it was a blade. Each word cut me out of the story, carving her name into places where mine had once belonged. It was not enough that she silenced me, not enough that she pushed me into the corner. She wanted to erase me entirely, to own not only the house, but its very history. And yet, as I listened, my sorrow deepened, but did not break me. Pride can dazzle, but it cannot endure. A house built on arrogance may glitter for a night, but its foundation cracks when truth rises. She believed her power was complete, her reign unquestioned, but I knew better. I knew that paper is patient, that ink is eternal, that memory waits in silence until its time arrives. So I let her drink, let her boast, let her claim what was not hers. For every word that erased me only brought her closer to the moment when truth would strike, when the cloth would be pulled away, and the chalk she tried to rub out would be revealed again, bold and undeniable. I sat there in silence, my hands folded on my lap, my gaze lowered to the rim of my untouched glass. The room around me pulsed with noise, her laughter, their applause, the hollow music of people who believed they were safe in their lies. I did not speak. I did not defend myself. I did not rise to demand recognition. And because I chose silence, they believed they had won. They mistook restraint for surrender, quiet for weakness, stillness for defeat. But silence is not always the mark of a broken man. Sometimes it is the gathering of storms behind the horizon, invisible until lightning tears the sky apart. My silence was not emptiness. It was weight. Every insult, every dismissal, every proud word that tried to erase me settled inside me like stones building a wall. They thought they had buried me beneath it, but in truth, they were fortifying me. Around the table I could hear their arrogance spilling in soft murmurs. They praised her, agreeing with her stories, congratulating her as though her pride were justified. They leaned toward her light, mistaking it for strength, never realizing it was only a reflection of what I had given, what I had built. Their complicity stung, yet I let them believe in their comfort. For silence, when carried long enough, becomes a mirror, and one day they would see themselves in it and flinch at what stared back. Inside me, memories stirred again, not as tender recollections, but as living proof. Proof of my nights spent repairing what storms had broken. Proof of the calloused hands that paid every debt. Proof of the lease signed with my name. The ink still as alive on the page as the day it was written. I did not need to raise my voice that night, because truth already lived beyond sound. They thought me defeated, but I sat taller in my silence than they did in their boasting. For arrogance has a short life, burning bright but fading quickly. Dignity, even silent dignity, lasts longer. My silence that evening was not the silence of a man erased, but the silence of a man who knew that words, once written, cannot be undone by voices raised at a dinner table. Let them mistake me. Let them believe I was nothing more than a guest. Storms do not announce themselves in whispers. They arrive suddenly, shattering, undeniable. And when the moment came, my silence would not remain silence. It would become revelation. The knock came just as her laughter reached its peak, a firm, measured sound against the wooden door, cutting through the chatter of the room like the toll of a bell. Conversation stilled, forks lowered, and all heads turned toward the entrance. My daughter rose with a spark in her eyes, her smile stretching wider as though fate itself had sent this moment to crown her pride. She hurried to the door with the eagerness of a host certain of her reign, certain that whoever stood beyond would recognize her as the rightful mistress of the house. When the landlord stepped inside, his presence carried a quiet authority that instantly shifted the air. He was not loud, not imposing, but there was weight in his stride, in the folder tucked neatly under his arm. Papers, the kind of papers that hold power greater than words, greater than pride. My daughter's voice, sweet and commanding, rose brightly to greet him, her tone dripping with certainty. She gestured toward the table, toward herself, as if to say, "Look, see, I am the one who owns, who rules, who belongs." She thought this arrival was her victory, her validation, her chance to seal the illusion she had woven all night. I watched from my corner, silent, my heart steady. There was no eagerness in me, no need to rise, no urge to explain. The folder the landlord carried was heavier than her pride, and the ink within it spoke a truth no laughter could erase. Still, she didn't see it. Her arrogance blinded her, made her believe that the world bent to her story, that paper would bow to her performance, just as the guests had. She pulled out a chair for him, her gestures theatrical, as though this moment were a stage and she the star. Her words spilled fast, her tone proud, already weaving a tale of her accomplishments, her control, her power. The room listened with a mix of anticipation and relief, believing the landlord's presence would be nothing more than applause to her self-written play. But I knew better. The folder he held was not applause, it was truth. And truth does not clap, it cuts. From my corner seat, I studied the landlord's calm expression. His eyes moved once across the room, not settling on her as she expected, but scanning, searching. My daughter's voice grew louder, brighter, desperate almost, as if by speaking more, faster, she could cement her place before a single page was turned. She did not yet notice the stillness in the landlord's face, the way his hand lingered on the folder, patient, deliberate. In that moment, I realized she believed this was her triumph, but what she welcomed with a smile was the beginning of her undoing. The knock on the door was not applause. It was judgment. Quiet, certain, waiting to unfold. The room held its breath when the landlord finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, yet it carried a weight that pressed down on every person seated at the table. He looked directly at my daughter, who was glowing with pride, expecting his words to be the crown placed upon her head. But instead, he asked the question that sliced the air apart. "Where is the leaseholder?" The silence that followed was thick, like a storm cloud rolling in, darkening every corner of the room. My daughter's smile widened, brimming with certainty, with arrogance polished by months of pretending she was queen of this house. She lifted her chin, gestured toward herself with an elegant wave, and in that gesture she believed she had sealed her ownership before all witnesses. She expected the landlord to nod, to affirm her story, to give her the public validation she craved, but he did not. His eyes, calm and searching, slid past her as though she were invisible. His gaze moved deliberately across the room, scanning the table, the faces, the corners. It did not rest where she expected, did not settle on the hand raised so proudly. The pause was longer than any speech, louder than any denial. The weight of his silence crushed her gesture, reducing it to nothing more than a vain performance. I felt the shift ripple through the air. Guests leaned forward, confused, their earlier certainty faltering. Whispers broke the edges of the silence. My daughter's hand, still hovering toward herself, began to tremble, though her smile remained fixed, brittle as glass about to crack. Her eyes flickered, searching the landlord's face for approval that did not come. The arrogance that had filled the room moments before began to wither, though she fought to keep it alive. From my corner I did not move. My hands remained still, my lips silent. I had no need to rise, no need to correct, no need to claim. The question had already undone her. For the truth is never loud, never frantic, it simply waits. And now the truth had spoken. Not in anger, not in accusation, but in a simple question that dismantled her performance, brick by brick. The landlord's eyes continued to search, steady, patient, until at last they found me. In that instant, the room itself seemed to exhale. The shift was undeniable. Every proud word she had spoken, every boastful claim, every dismissal she had thrown at me now trembled in the shadow of that gaze. She had tried to erase me, but the truth had come looking, and it had found me where I sat in silence. And though I did not yet speak, my presence alone answered more loudly than she ever could. The folder opened with the soft rustle of paper, but to me it sounded like thunder rolling through the room. The landlord's hands moved with calm precision, pulling out the lease, a single document that held more power than all the voices that had tried to erase me. The paper was unfolded slowly, deliberately, and when it lay flat in his hands, silence consumed the air. Every eye fixed on it, every breath seemed to pause. There it was, my name, bold, unmovable, undeniable. Ink that had dried years ago, still alive, still speaking with more authority than the arrogance that had filled this room all night. My name, written not in whispers or in fragile boasts, but in permanence, a truth that could not be erased, no matter how loudly pride tried to shout it away. The landlord's voice was steady as he read it aloud, and hearing my name spoken with that authority sent a weight through me, both heavy and liberating. Heavy because of the years I had carried the silence of being dismissed in my own home. Liberating because in that moment, the truth stood taller than the lies, taller than the betrayal, taller than my daughter's cruel pride. My daughter's face drained of color, her confident smile collapsing into silence. Her hand, once raised in arrogance, now clutched at her glass as if it could anchor her against the truth. Around the table, guests shifted, shame rippling across their features. The same people who had nodded at her stories, who had accepted her rewriting of history, now stared at the lease with the eyes of witnesses caught in their complicity. Their silence could no longer protect her. Their silence now only condemned them. I did not rise. I did not gloat. I did not need to. My name was already standing for me, stronger than any argument I could ever give. The ink on that page spoke with a voice louder than pride, firmer than betrayal, unbreakable by arrogance. For years they had tried to treat me as a shadow. Tonight, the paper revealed I had been the foundation all along. I sat in my corner, the guest they had dismissed. And yet in that moment, I was the only one who truly belonged. The house itself, through the words written in that lease, declared it so. And nothing, not pride, not betrayal, not silence, could erase it. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. My daughter's voice, once so sharp and commanding, broke against it like glass shattering on stone. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The confidence that had filled her all evening drained away, leaving only fragments, half-breaths, trembling pauses, eyes darting in desperation for support that no one dared to give. Her pride, which had towered above us all, now stood in ruins at her feet. The guests shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes dropping to the table, to their plates, to anything but me. Forks lay abandoned, glasses untouched. No one wanted to meet my gaze, for in my silence they saw themselves reflected. They had laughed with her, nodded with her, allowed her arrogance to erase me, and now, with the paper in the landlord's hands, they realized their complicity. They had bowed to a false crown while the true name, the true foundation, had sat quietly in the corner all along. It was not anger that filled the room now. It was shame. Shame that seeped into every corner, choking out the laughter that had once filled the air. Even the fire in the hearth seemed quiet, its crackle subdued, as if the house itself refused to honor their pretense any longer. They had called me a guest. They had stripped me of belonging. And yet, here in black ink, undeniable, the truth had declared me master of the house. I did not gloat. I did not rise with fury. I remained where I was, calm, steady, watching them wrestle with the weight of their own silence. For this was not my victory to shout. It was their shame to bear. Every bowed head, every averted eye, every faltering breath, was justice written not on paper this time, but on their hearts. They knew now what they had done, how easily they had betrayed truth for the comfort of pride. My daughter's face burned with the collapse of her authority. The hand that once lifted her glass to boast now trembled as it gripped the stem, her knuckles white, her lips pressed tight to keep from breaking. She had wanted the landlord to validate her reign. Instead, he had unveiled the truth, and with it stripped her bare before everyone she had tried to impress. I sat in silence, not as a man defeated, but as a man restored. They could no longer call me a guest. They could no longer deny what the very walls of this house bore witness to. My name was not just on the lease. It was written into the foundation, into every nail, every beam, every sacrifice. They had tried to bury me in shadows, but truth does not stay buried. It rises, undeniable, unerasable. I rose slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor, a sound so quiet and yet so commanding that every head lifted instinctively. I did not slam my hand on the table. I did not shout for apologies. I did not scold my daughter or the guest who had chosen silence over truth. Rage was too small for a moment such as this. Instead, I stood with the weight of dignity that no insult, no betrayal, no cruel dismissal could ever strip from me. My body might have bent with years of labor, but my spirit rose straighter than the tallest pillar in that room. The landlord looked at me and gave a small, respectful nod, as if to acknowledge what the paper had already revealed. This house was mine. This name was mine. This place was mine. I returned his nod with quiet gratitude, for he had been the messenger of truth, though the truth itself had always been waiting in silence. There was no need for words between us. He held the proof in his folder, and I held the proof in every breath I took in this house. The guests shifted, their shame hanging heavy in the air, but I did not linger on them. I did not need their remorse. I did not need their apologies. Their regret was theirs to carry, not mine to demand. Justice had already arrived, not through fury, but through revelation. My daughter sat frozen, her lips pressed tight, her eyes downcast. She did not dare to meet mine, and I in turn offered her no words of scorn. To shame her with anger would have been easy. To let her sit with the silence of her own undoing was harder, and far heavier. I walked slowly toward the door, not rushing, not stumbling. Each step was steady, unshaken, as though I were not leaving in humiliation, but carrying myself with a kind of triumph that no one could deny. Dignity is not in raising your voice. It is in walking away with your head unbowed. And as I reached for my coat, I felt the weight of their eyes following me. Not out of pity now, but out of reverence they did not know how to speak. For they had seen something stronger than anger. They had seen a man who did not need to demand respect because truth had already given it to him. My silence, my calm, my refusal to strike back, stood taller than all their arrogance combined. They had tried to reduce me to a guest. That night I left as the rightful master, not because I declared it, but because dignity needs no declaration. The door closed softly behind the landlord, but the silence he left behind thundered through the room. His footsteps faded down the hallway, yet his presence remained like a seal pressed onto wax. The folder was gone, but the truth it carried still lay heavy across every face at the table. No one dared to raise a glass now. No one dared to laugh. The air was thick with whispers that had no sound, shame that had no language. My name, once dismissed, belittled, erased with a single cruel phrase, now hung unspoken in their minds, heavier than the chandelier that trembled faintly above. They would never again call me a guest. They could not. The word had lost its power, stripped bare by ink and memory, destroyed by the permanence of paper. My name was carved deeper than pride, deeper than betrayal, deeper than the silence they had tried to bury me under. It lived in the beams I had raised, in the walls I had painted, in the foundation that bore the weight of every moment they now enjoyed. Even if their lips never spoke it aloud again, their hearts would never escape it. For each corner of that house whispered my belonging, each stone carried my imprint, each memory breathed my sacrifice. I walked through the doorway with measured steps, not rushing, not faltering. Behind me I felt their eyes burning, not with contempt anymore, not with mockery, but with the weight of recognition they could no longer deny. My daughter's gaze clung to me most of all. She sat rigid, her pride shattered, her silence now a confession louder than any apology could ever be. She had tried to erase me with words. She had tried to crown herself with false ownership. But in the end, she had been left small, stripped of her performance, facing the undeniable legacy of the man she had called just a guest. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, a balm to the fire that had burned inside me all evening. I drew in a deep breath, steady and full, as though the world itself had handed me back what they had stolen, my dignity, my name, my place. I did not need to look back. The house stood behind me, not as a place that had rejected me, but as a monument to every sacrifice I had made, every wound I had endured, every truth I had carried in silence. They would whisper about me long after that night. They would tell the story of how the father sat in silence, how they mistook him for weak, how the landlord revealed the truth with paper no tongue could deny. And those whispers would grow heavier with time, turning into respect, into awe, into something they had once refused to give me freely. They would never again see me as a guest. They would never again laugh when I tried to speak. My name was now etched into their memory, unerasable, undeniable. I walked away with no anger, no bitterness, only the quiet strength of a man who knew that legacies are not measured in applause or pride. Legacies are measured in the foundations that endure, in the names that outlast betrayal, in the truths that time itself cannot bury. And mine, my name, my work, my sacrifice, was now sealed into the story of that house forever.